to part 2 tomorrow.
Go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second and final of the Clark Lectures in the year 2008. Since Professor Marcus gave such a splendid introduction yesterday that could not be bettered, and since our time is short, we will go ahead and proceed directly to part 2 of Professor Allison's lecture on the topic, the historical and theological Jesus. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dale Allison.
When, in the 1970s, I first began studying theology, a number of books informed me that Christianity is an historical religion. These volumes stressed that my faith, unlike that of Hindus and Buddhists, had grown out of real events. To use the titles of two of those books, The God Who Acts had established salvation in history. The implication seemed to be that Judaism and Christianity were, in their historical nature and claims, unique and so preferable. My teenage mind, interested in knowing what might be distinctive about Christianity, went along. It made sense to me that the Bible was largely an interpretation of the deity's saving activities in the past. Indeed, and in retrospect, this conviction nudged me toward my chosen profession, biblical studies. And it was years before I cared much about anything other than historical questions. I remember one occasion during graduate school right here at Duke, when a guest lecturer spoke eloquently about Mark's literary artistry. I was impatient. Who cares about Mark? I thought to myself. I want to know about Jesus. Continued study, however, began to teach me that history is not the epistemological bulwark that I had early on expected it to be. Instead of becoming my security, it turned out to be my insecurity. Not only, I decided, will intelligent scholars perpetually debate the really important and interesting issues, but many of those issues will forever remain contested in my own mind. At some point, moreover, I awakened to the obvious. Facts don't dictate their interpretation, nor does history carry its own meaning. Theology comes out of history only after one has read it into history. The past, or rather modern historical reconstructions of the past, can't then be the point of departure for religious faith or theology. Having come to these realizations, I didn't go on to infer that the past is neither theologically here nor there, for it seemed obvious that some Christian beliefs require historical correlates, and that some of those correlates might be subject to critical investigation and revision. For example, the words "suffered under Pontius Pilate" belong to the Apostles' Creed, and they are straightforward enough. If there was no Jesus of Nazareth who died between the years 26 and 37 AD, when Pilate was prefect of Judea, then something thought to be importantly true would be indisputably false. And while it's wildly unlikely that any evidence will ever call into question crucified under Pontius Pilate, it's conceivable, at least hypothetically, that new discoveries could change our minds. Some modern scholars, furthermore, would say that we have already learned a few things that should amend our theological constructions. But that's not our topic for today. What I rather wish to do in the first part of this second lecture is ask a sort of preliminary question, namely, how much history does theology require? John Keats' poem on first looking into Chapman's Homer ends with these well-known words. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken. Or like stout Cortez when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific and all his men, looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. It was Balboa, not Cortez, of course, who discovered the Pacific Ocean. Yet the poem is no worse for the error. As M.H. Abrams wrote, the factual mistake matters to history, but not to poetry. One is reminded of what W.B. Stanford said about Homer's Odyssey. For appreciation of his poem and story, it makes little difference whether Ithaca is Theaki or the Isle of Man or Rhode Island. What then of the canonical Gospels? They too are works of literature, so why, you might ask, should we fret over how much history is in them? To what extent are the Gospels like the parables that Jesus told? It's beside the point to ask whether he ever learned of a merchant who sold all that he had to buy a pearl of exceeding value. And some of the church fathers were wasting their exegetical time when they discussed whether the story of a rich man suffering in Gehenna while a poor man named Lazarus is comforted in Abraham's bosom actually took place. Should we not live by the golden rule, whether Jesus spoke it or not? What difference would it make if we learned that he had been crucified not outside the walls of Jerusalem, but outside the walls of Jericho? Maybe some would say discussions over the historicity of the Gospels are of little more value than the debates as to whether Shakespeare really wrote the plays attributed to him. Some of the arguments against the traditional ascription may intrigue, but what can they have to do with the value of the Shakespearean corpus, whose merits are independent of its authorship? If we can separate art from the artist, why can't we separate the literary Jesus and the theological Jesus from the historical Jesus? The question gains impetus from modern study of the Bible. For many of us within the churches have changed our minds about the importance of history for understanding any number of scriptural books. We no longer, for example, look to Genesis if we are seeking to gather facts about the cosmological or geological past, but rather consult geologists and cosmologists. Similarly, we learn about human origins not by reading the Bible as a handbook of natural science, but by acquainting ourselves with what anthropologists and scholars of prehistory have to tell us. Adam and Eve have ceased to be historical individuals and are now purely theological figures. This doesn't mean, however, that Genesis has ceased to function as Scripture. We've learned how to read the text as theology without reading it as history. We can believe in God as creator and profess the world to be good without worrying about the location of Eden or how it is that a snake could speak. Recognition of the unhistorical nature of some scriptural texts is hardly a recent innovation, even if moderns have gone further than did any of the ancients. Here's a dispute from the Talmud. One of the rabbis was sitting before Rabbi Samuel ben Nachmani, and as he expounded, he said, "Job never was. He never existed. He's only a parable." Samuel said to him, "Against you the text says, there was a man from the land of Uz whose name was Job." But the other retorted, "If that is so, what of the verse? The poor man had nothing except one poor lamb, which he had brought up and nourished," referring to Nathan's parable to David. Is that anything but a parable? The book of Job is also a parable. Rabbi Samuel's antagonist was no doubt correct. Job's not fact. It's fiction, as Theodore of Mopsuestia, the 4th century church father, also recognized when he likened the book to Greek tragedy. And Job's fictional nature has nothing to do with the book's value. Theodore and his rabbinic counterpart were not alone in believing that narratives can have theological meaning without being historical. The famous Cappadocian saint and theologian, Gregory of Nyssa, was taken aback by the 10th plague in the story of the Exodus from Egypt. The death of the firstborn made no ethical sense to him. I quote, "Pharaoh is unjust, and instead of him, punishment falls upon his newborn child, who on account of his infant age is unable to discern what is good and what is not good. If such a one now pays the penalty of his father's evil, where is justice? Where is piety? Where is holiness? Where is Ezekiel, who said, 'The soul that sins is the one that must die'? And again, 'The son should not suffer for the sin of the father.' How can the history so oppose reason?" Gregory answered his own questions by dissolving the narrative's historicity. Unable to find the true spiritual meaning in the literal past, he decided that the events took place typologically, and that we should come away not with a history lesson, but with a spiritual lesson. By all means, kill sin at its inception. Origen, Gregory's theological ancestor, was also troubled by the divine violence in Scripture, and he made similar exegetical moves on a number of occasions. If violence in Scripture forced Origen and Gregory at times to deny history without denying theology, modern critical scholarship gives us additional reason to do the same. We now know that Noah's Ark comes from the imagination. There was no ark full of animals. Similarly, when I've quizzed my Old Testament colleagues and asked them, "Was there an historical Moses?" they've typically responded, not very helpfully, "Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't." And so it goes. Much of what people once took to be history is now known to be or suspected to be something else. So if meaning is to stay after history has gone, meaning can't always and everywhere depend upon history. Now, some have no trouble carrying this thought through much of the Gospels. John Dominic Crossan has written that Emmaus never happened, Emmaus always happens. By this he means that the story in Luke 24 is symbolic, a metaphoric condensation of the first years of Christian thought and practice into one parabolic afternoon. The rest of the Easter narratives receive similar treatment from Crossan. His version of the Christian faith doesn't require that the concluding chapters of the Gospels report any historical events. Belief in the resurrection is not for Crossan a conviction about Jesus' molecules, about whether they became miraculously reanimated and left the tomb. Indeed, there was, according to Crossan, no tomb at all. Jesus' lifeless body was probably thrown onto a pile for scavengers. Other Christians, however, understandably find themselves with an altogether different view of things. For them, faith without history, indeed without a lot of history, is dead. Some, for instance, may be confident that confession of the resurrection requires that the tomb was emptied by supernatural means. Arguments that it was not, such as are found in Crossan's writings, can only for such believers undermine the Christian faith, just as arguments purporting to show to the contrary that the tomb was empty can be construed as evidence for the truth of our faith. One is reminded of C.S. Lewis, who claimed in retrospect that an important contributing factor to his conversion was the realization, I quote, "The evidence for the historicity of the Gospels is really surprisingly good." Well, should we side with Lewis? History matters a lot. Or with Crossan? History doesn't matter so much. It might occur to some of you, as it has to me, that perhaps exegesis can come to our assistance in answering this question. Why not follow the intention of the text? When we say that Job is a work of fiction, we may be going against much of the tradition, but we're almost certainly recovering the original intention of the book's contributors. Likewise, maybe historians can show us which episodes the evangelists thought of as sober history and which they thought of as Haggadah, as edifying story. Can historical criticism not divine, for instance, that Matthew redactionally created the story of Peter walking on the water and intended it to be not history but parable? Can't we also figure out that whoever crafted Matthew's infancy narrative did so out of scriptural materials and knew himself to be creating theological parables, not sober history? There are two problems here. One is that it is unfortunately impossible to answer such questions with any real conviction. I've been trying to do it for years, and I've come up empty. You may doubt that Peter walked on the water, but you have no way of knowing what Matthew thought about the matter. You may also surmise that Matthew's infancy story is in part legend, but I don't see how to determine whether Matthew was of the same mind. There just aren't enough clues in his text for resolving such issues. More importantly, the intention of the text can't be our sole or even chief guide. Contemporary Christians who read Genesis as theological saga instead of historical record do so not because of what a close reading of the book has taught them, but because of what science and archaeology have demanded. That is, convictions acquired independently of the text have moved us to construe it in a certain fashion. And this is the rule for all of our reading. Presuppositions extrinsic to the text greatly influence how we interpret them. Let me illustrate by briefly turning from history to eschatology. Mark 13:26 pledges that the Son of Man will someday come on the clouds of heaven. Determining what that verse meant in the first century is one thing. Determining what it means for somebody today is quite another. Imagine four different readers: a fundamentalist, a liberal Protestant, a sympathetic non-Christian, and an unsympathetic atheist. All four, let us say, agree that the evangelist Mark expected someday to look up into the sky and to see Jesus upon the clouds. After that, agreement fails. The fundamentalist claims that Mark's literal understanding is binding for interpretation. We too should look to the skies from whence Jesus, our Savior, will someday return. Our liberal Protestant responds that, whatever the ancients thought, people can't ride on clouds. So, we're compelled to view Mark 13:26 as a mythological statement. The verse is a way of affirming that the God of Jesus Christ will set things right in the end. The sympathetic non-Christian, disbelieving in a deity, disagrees with both the fundamentalist and the liberal, and instead finds the real meaning of Mark 13:26 to lie in the fact that people always need hope, even if it's only hope in a myth. The unsympathetic atheist then retorts that Jesus has not returned and will never return, and so the true meaning of Mark 13:26 is that Christians are deluded, their faith vain. The lesson to draw from our four exegetes is that a text is never the sole determinant of its interpretation or application. Readings are rather joint productions. They require not only judgment as to what a text meant to those in the past, but also judgment as to what it should or can mean in the present. And this involves convictions extrinsic to the texts themselves. Matters aren't otherwise with historical questions. They are observer-dependent and reflect internalized metaphysical and historical assumptions. Determining whether Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John believe something is not necessarily the same as determining whether we can or should believe it. Additional factors are involved, including one's historical shrewdness, and/or, as with a miracle, one's philosophical disposition, and/or, as with Gregory of Nyssa and the 10th plague, one's moral sense. So the question, how much history does theology require, has as its answer, it depends upon one's presuppositions, one's worldview, one's theology, and so on. Although this outcome is disappointingly obvious, three attendant considerations keep it from being altogether trite. First, one's theology, worldview, and presuppositions need not be fixed for life, as though a person raised in a particular ideological camp must be stuck there forever. It's possible, as many of us know from personal experience, to learn to be self-critical and to change one's mind, even on matters of great existential import. Honest reflection can alter perception. Second, as I stressed earlier, many biblical texts that were once presumed to be historical and yet are now known to be unhistorical, Genesis 3, for example, are still capable of producing theological and religious meaning. This should caution us. Some things once thought essential and immutable have shown themselves to be inessential and mutable. And over the past 2 centuries, many Christians have learned to get along with less history than did their predecessors. Does the future hold more of the same? I don't know. But the subject is all the more vexing for me in the light of my students' exegetical papers. When I ask them to write on a passage in the Gospels, I often require that near the beginning they address the matter of origin. Does their selected text go back to a word or an activity of Jesus? Or did the early Christians rather invent it? How much can be attributed to the evangelist's hand? I've discovered over the years that the students' decisions about origin, whether well-grounded or not, have little or nothing to do with their subsequent exegesis. Their theological, homiletical, and devotional meditations are not organically related to their verdicts about what really happened. The different subjects, to the contrary, remain unconnected. What does this mean? I don't know. Third, if we can ask, I don't. The one thing I'm hoping is it doesn't mean they have a bad teacher. Third, if we can ask, how much history does theology require? We can equally ask, how much history can historians provide? That is, we can inquire about supply rather than demand. From one point of view, in fact, one could say it doesn't really matter what theology wants or thinks that it requires, because this begs the question of what there is to be had. But the subject of what we can expect to get from historians isn't the business of these lectures, and I must now turn to the next topic, which I can introduce with a series of questions. What are we to think when our modern historical reconstructions don't match the narratives of our sacred texts? Does history become our authority and so trump the text? Can history somehow replace the text? And what's the theological status of a passage whose historicity is debated or denied? Some have no difficulty answering such questions. When text and history depart, defrock the former and coronate the latter. This was the view of the late Robert Funk. If historical results contradict the claims of a text, then so much the worse for the text. Its theological authority is gone. Several years ago, the common lectionary reading for Sunday included Luke 16:18. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. I know of a Presbyterian pastor in Pittsburgh who, much taken with the Jesus seminar, checked the status of Luke 16:18 in the 5 Gospels, the seminar's official public statement of its voting results. As it turned out, Luke 16:18 is colored gray, which means that, in the very questionable collective judgment of the seminar, Jesus probably didn't utter it. The pastor made this circumstance the excuse for not wrestling with the difficult imperative. Jesus, he told his congregation, was probably not the author of this saying. It was rather formulated by an anonymous early Christian. And why, it was implied, should anyone heed an anonymous early Christian? Christians, after all, follow Jesus. Whatever view you take of divorce or of the origin of this saying, it must be conceded that this Presbyterian pastor's approach to Scripture could never have occurred to Origen or Augustine, to Calvin or Wesley. The hermeneutical move is distinctly modern and, in my judgment, mistaken. If only the sayings that Jesus really spoke merit our attention, does this not imply that John's Gospel, whose discourses are so widely thought to be mostly post-Easter meditations, must lose its canonical status altogether? We also have to ask, if we are to preach only the historical Jesus, whether we should still base sermons upon Paul's epistles. For his theology is much more than a reiteration of things that Jesus said and did. Indeed, his theology and practice are in some respects strikingly different from things that Jesus said and did. So how can Paul be in any way normative? If, however, we decide that Paul is nonetheless normative, should we not, if we adhere to our pastor's logic, confine ourselves to the authentic Paulines? Ephesians and the pastorals are probably, after all, pseudepigraphical. And why would anyone refuse to preach upon a word dubiously ascribed to Jesus, yet preach upon a word dubiously ascribed to Paul? What, moreover, should those of us who can't decide whether Paul wrote Colossians do when a passage from that epistle shows up in the lectionary? Should we expound the text or not? Above all, what happens to the Bible as a whole if history and authorship become criteria for determining theological authority? What, for instance, should we do with the so-called historical books of the Old Testament, which contain so much that isn't history? And what should we do with paragraphs and chapters that come to us under the name of Isaiah or some other prophet, but which, according to critical scholarship, were instead produced by persons forever unknown? Buddhist eschatology, just like Jewish and Christian eschatology, has it that in the latter days things will go from bad to worse. One old prophecy warns that among the horrors of the end, the sacred writings will disappear. It's not that the books themselves will cease to exist, but rather that their letters will evaporate. The characters will simply vanish from the pages, so that the hallowed words will be no more. People will have to face the fearsome end without the guidance of their fortifying scriptures. I've sometimes thought about this arresting prophecy when ruminating on our Christian Bible. Although our letters are still on the page, much of the history that we once assumed to be there has in fact evaporated. Not entirely, to be sure, but if we've had a decent religious education, we certainly have less history than we used to. And isn't it ironic that it's precisely in this age of diminishing history that some proceed as though the theological truth of the Gospels depends upon the results of historical critical analysis? Those who urge that Christian theology should eschew all fiction when constructing its Jesus will have to dismantle Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, pull out the component parts deemed historical, and put them together in a new way. They will then presumably put their faith in the new reconstruction instead of in the canonical Gospels, in the same way that one might put more trust in a modern book on the Roman Empire than in Tacitus. Yet, in my opinion, this would be to confuse the historical task with the theological task. The status and function of a canonical text within the Church is not the same as the status and function of that text within the academy. As an historian, I'm all for tearing up the surface of the Gospels and doing the messy work of excavating them for history. As a churchgoer, however, I believe that the Gospels should be preached and interpreted as they stand, as canonical literature. I'm persuaded that for most theological purposes, we should treat the Gospels the same way we treat Genesis. We should use them, first of all, not to reconstruct the past, but to construe our world theologically. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are for the churches theological texts before they are historical texts. Just maybe here, the instinct of my students when they write their exegetical papers is sound. As already observed, they typically spend time trying to determine the origin of whatever passage it is they are interpreting. Yet their exegesis rarely, if ever, hinges upon their understanding of a text's tradition, history, or even upon their verdict, if they can reach one, as to its originating author. My seminarians proceed as if reconstructing the past is one task, expounding the meaning of a text for the present quite another. The insignificance, at least for certain purposes, of the issue of historicity also becomes apparent when we consider how the modern churches have treated John 7:53 and following, the story of Jesus' encounter with a woman caught in adultery. These verses, which contain several words and constructions found nowhere else in John, are missing from most of the older Greek manuscripts. They're also absent from many Latin, Coptic, Syriac, and Armenian witnesses. Some old manuscripts mark the paragraph with asterisks. Others place the lines after John 7:36 or John 21:25 or Luke 21:38 or Luke 24:53. For these and other reasons, we know that John 7:53 following was no original part of the fourth gospel. Where it comes from, no one knows. And whether it holds a memory of an historical encounter between Jesus and an unfortunate woman, no one knows. Yet this scarcely makes any difference for practical ecclesiastical purposes. This passage is still in our Bibles and will remain there indefinitely, even if set apart by extra spaces before and after, because the churches have collectively judged it to be memorable and edifying. It matters not that it's a secondary addition, although surely it would matter if the text were not so edifying. I think then we'd cut it out. By the way, we treat the ending of Mark very differently. We don't really like the snake handling stuff, so we're happy to sort of set that aside and not pay so much attention to it. But we're not doing that with this other passage. It matters not that this passage may fail to reflect an event in the life of Jesus. What counts is that the text has spoken and continues to speak meaningfully to those in the churches. It should be the same with the canonical Gospels in their entirety. It's the biblical texts, not the reconstructed history behind them, that have nurtured Christians through the centuries, supplied us with our liturgical readings, been the inspiration for countless sermons, and contributed to Christian doctrine and moral teaching. For theologians or preachers effectively to ignore those portions of the Gospels that some contemporary historians deem unhistorical is to change the rules of the game, and I think it's too late for that. Matthew and Luke may have swallowed up, if it existed, and I know a lot of people here don't think it existed, but Matthew and Luke are not going to be swallowed up. The canon, for better and for worse, has long since been established. Christians can't abandon it without abandoning their religion. The Gospels remain the Church's heritage and an inescapable part of Christian identity. We can't just jettison them or parts of them, at least not without ceasing to be ourselves. Now, of course, some would loudly protest that jettisoning the Bible or vast swaths of it is exactly what Christians need to do, given modern knowledge. Once text and history have split asunder, one can't hold fast to both, and it is to history that we owe our allegiance. But one can and ought to hold fast to both. Nothing compels us to concur with the fundamentalists in insisting, along with, ironically, anti-ecclesiastical polemicists, that if Peter didn't literally walk upon the waves, then Matthew 14:22 following signifies nothing. Such a hermeneutical move is unsophisticated and unimaginative, and we should reject it. The texts remain the same texts that they have always been, regardless of current views as to the history behind them. Modern historical methods may help us to interpret our texts, but they should not depose them. Historical studies of the Bible belong not on the lectern, but on the bookshelves. They are, for the churches, commentaries. Their function is not to displace the canonical texts, but to help us to better understand them. Having said all this, let me add quickly that historical reconstructions of Jesus still matter theologically, I think. Even when theologians no longer view Genesis as a source book of history and science, they must, for certain purposes, still concern themselves with the origins of the cosmos and the origins of the human species. Scientific and historical questions about what really happened remain important, even theologically important, despite the modern verdict that Genesis addresses other issues. The Gospels and the historical Jesus are, I believe, no different. Even as we recognize that the canonical texts can't be exchanged for the history behind them, this scarcely entails that such history is theologically of no account. Unfortunately, however, I have only 2 lectures, not 3. So I don't have the opportunity here to suggest some ways in which history or the historical Jesus might be theologically significant. But I do have time to ponder one more question, a question that some of my divinity students have asked me. It's a simple and naive question, and it often stumps me. It's this: how might one come to know Jesus? Well, there's more than one Jesus. There's the textual Jesus of antiquity, that is, the several canonical and extra-canonical presentations of him. There's the earthly Jesus of the first century, the man who spoke with Peter and Judas. There's the so-called historical Jesus, or rather the competing modern reconstructions of him. There's the Jesus of church history and tradition, or rather the numerous religious conceptions of him through the ages. And then there's Jesus as he is now in his post-mortem existence, the risen Christ who many claim still to encounter in any number of ways. Jesus isn't one, but many. The diversity of images, claims, and experiences poses not only an ontological problem, who exactly was or is Jesus, but further, an epistemological question. How do we come to know him? What is his identity? A few things are clear. We become acquainted with the textual Jesus by reading or hearing old books. We can't, barring invention of a time machine, acquaint ourselves with the earthly Jesus, the son of Mary and Joseph, who lived in Nazareth. We can learn about him only indirectly through historical study. Doing history is also how we come to know the Jesus of ecclesiastical tradition. Books and articles on Christian doctrine and practice tutor us. As for how one comes to know the risen or contemporary Jesus, this happens through a Christian community, through its worship services, educational programs, and common religious life. Some would add that knowledge of him stems above all from personal encounter, such as feeling his presence or sensing him in one's heart or even beholding him in a vision. Our problem is that the various means don't run to the same end. We have John versus the Synoptics, Athanasius versus Arius, Wright versus Borg, and on it goes. Our sundry authorities and diverse experiences have created a catena of Christ, who then among the rivals is the real Jesus. Well, I have no simple, straightforward answer. So let me wind down this lecture simply by introducing a few lines of thought. Maybe they're worth pursuing. First, it is, if we are candid, easy to despair, easy to adopt the indifference of Sherlock Holmes. Each may form his own hypothesis upon the present evidence, and yours is as likely to be correct as mine. Jesus seems to be like a chameleon. He takes his color from whoever recreates him. Like Odysseus in the first line of the Odyssey, he is a man of many turns, of remarkable versatility, who appears now like this, now like that. We may, however, find some consolation in this, that Jesus, insofar as the representations of him make for a confusing assortment, is not wholly different from the rest of us. We all play several roles in life, and different people perceive us differently. What our immediate families think about us is not the same as what our friends think. And our enemies, if we have any, imagine something else again. It is, moreover, the fate of the famous to be especially subject to multiple and contradictory assessments. If perception is relative, then the more perceivers there are, the more perceptions there will be, and the greater their variety. A wide range of opinions accordingly attaches to all well-known figures, whether they be politicians, entertainers, or religious leaders. Alexander of Macedon, Constantine the Great, and Teresa of Avila have all sat for many dissimilar portraits, as have Martin Luther, Abraham Lincoln, and Queen Victoria. One might, in fact, formulate a rule. The more important people are thought to be, the more diverse the array of verdicts about them. Given Jesus' importance to world civilization and religion, a bewildering mixture of judgments can't but be expected. Jesus, the secular sage, versus Jesus, the eschatological prophet, versus Jesus, the social reformer, and so on, is not so much different than Paul the rabbi versus Paul the Hellenizer versus Paul the apocalypticist, etc. The relativity of perception is, incidentally, hardly a modern discovery. Several ancient Christian texts are familiar with the notion of the polymorphous Christ. Origen wrote that, although Jesus was a single individual, people perceived him according to their abilities, according to their aptitude and inclination, and so he did not look the same to all, including all believers. This idea takes story form in a number of old books, in which Jesus literally looks like John the Baptist to one, to Paul, like Paul to another, like a woman to another, like a star to another, and like a child to another. One text even declares that Jesus is beautiful and ugly, young and old, great and small, for we all see as capacity permits. Now, surely one function of the canon is to set some limits to diversity so that we don't descend into solipsistic eisegesis. And yet it remains true that the nature and identity of Jesus, like the nature and identity of everyone else, are in the eye of the beholder. What we see is always a function of our being. Adults see things differently than do children, and bats perceive the world differently than do flies. Such physiological and psychological facts have their analogies in the religious realm. Matthew 5:8 says that the pure in heart will see God. This assertion correlates sacred knowledge with one's moral disposition. Knowledge of Jesus may have a similar correlation. For Jesus was, among other things, a moral teacher, and the truth of much of his teachings is in the living. Those who seek to conduct their lives in the light of the canonical accounts of his life and speech will understand him differently than those who find guidance elsewhere. To read a parable that commends feeding the hungry and visiting prisoners is one thing. To respond by visiting prisoners and feeding the hungry is quite another. It's perhaps a bit like being a Shakespearean actor who experiences the plays in ways remote from those of us who never walk the stage. The Sermon on the Mount does not look the same from the outside as it does from the inside. In this connection, I recall the famed words with which Albert Schweitzer ended his quest of the historical Jesus. He comes to us as one unknown, without a name, as of old by the lakeside. He came to those men who did not know who he was. He says the same words, "Follow me," and sets us to those tasks which he must fulfill in our time. He commands, and to those who hearken to him, whether wise or unwise, he will reveal himself in the peace, the labors, the conflicts, and the suffering that they may experience in his fellowship. And as an ineffable mystery, they will learn who he is. Although Schweitzer set out to find Jesus through historical, critical sleuthing, and although he believed that he had indeed found him, he also recognized the limitations of his higher critical tactics and conclusions. He understood that there is, in addition to all of our inferences about the history behind the texts, the first-hand experience of personally striving as best one can to enter into his moral and religious vision. Without such effort, our knowledge of him is the less. As the Jesus of Matthew says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me." Now to my next point. Countless Christians throughout the ages have thought themselves to know Jesus, not just through the memories of the church or through observance of his words, but also through personal encounters with him. What should we say to this? Let me approach the question by recounting the dramatic vision of a friend of mine. Several years ago, she was suffering a personal crisis. Her family life was in trouble, and she was racked with guilt. Indeed, she felt that she was deserving of hell. One afternoon, while sitting alone in her living room, one of the walls split open, revealing another reality, what appeared to be outer space, with spinning planets and glorious colors she had never seen before. Then amid the planets, she saw a figure walking toward her. Somehow, she says, she knew this was Jesus, although she saw no face. Because of her shame, my friend dropped her eyes to the floor, fearfully awaiting words of condemnation. But her Jesus instead sat beside her and said, "What can I do for you?" She told him, and he responded with encouragement and instruction. Then the living room wall reappeared and everything returned to normal. But my friend was no longer the person she had been before. She felt forgiven, comforted, guided, and she thankfully entered a new and better chapter in her life. Often our initial response to a report such as this is to offer an explanation. Either we are credulous or we are incredulous. We suppose either that Jesus really did appear and speak, or we assert that visions are hallucinations, nothing but projected subjectivity. The truth to my mind, however, is that unless we are dogmatic, flat earth materialists, we just don't know what actually took place. If I may be candid, because I have myself ostensibly both seen and heard from a deceased friend, and because members of my immediate family and some close friends I trust have had similar experiences, my mind is open to possibilities more than mundane. Regarding visions of Jesus in particular, my thinking is this: if, as they may, the dead on occasion somehow communicate with the living, why should Jesus be incapable of such? At the same time, there's a very large body of critical literature on hallucinations, which scarcely encourages us to be naive about them. People, including perfectly normal people, often see and hear things that aren't there. Skepticism stands on a solid mountain of evidence. So I don't claim to know what really happened to my friend in her living room. But just as we can contemplate the meaning of a saying attributed to Jesus without knowing whether or not he authored it, maybe we can contemplate the theological content of visionary and other subjective religious experiences without knowing their precise etiology. Whatever the scientific or paranormal explanation of my friend's vision, we recognize her Jesus. He's the canonical Jesus who acts with compassion and offers forgiveness to those burdened by past failure. He's particularly like the Jesus of John 7:53 and following, who doesn't condemn the woman caught in adultery. but protects her from others and then encourages her to believe that she can begin her life anew. Indeed, one could plausibly regard my friend's experience as a creative and personal exegesis of certain New Testament texts or stories about Jesus. Perhaps religious experiences that are perceived as encounters with Jesus belong to what the Germans call his Wirkungsgeschichte, or history of effects. And so, as I argued in yesterday's lecture, say something about his identity. For whatever else they may be, Christological experiences are responses to biblical and ecclesiastical traditions about Jesus, to the powerful images and ideas Christians have passed down regarding him. Ideas and images often much influenced by the canonical Gospels, and so in my judgment at least, partly informed by authentic memories of Jesus. This is true not just of the sort of dramatic vision my friend had. It also holds for more run-of-the-mill events. Those who in a Christian context feel themselves to be unexpectedly and graciously forgiven are experiencing Jesus' continuing influence. And those who after reading the Gospels feel compelled to serve the marginal are responding to his enduring demands. To come now to my final point, after which I shall shut up. Matthew 25, in depicting the Last Judgment, refers to people who have met Jesus without knowing it. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from each other as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." This is not the place to argue about the interpretation of a text. I will simply give it as my opinion that all the nations includes all of humanity, Christian and otherwise, and that the needy are all in distress, Christian and otherwise. This passage then, like Jesus' injunction to love even enemies, blurs distinctions between insiders and outsiders. The upshot is that in this remarkable version of the Great Assize, religious affiliation or confession plays no role. Deeds of loving kindness trump everything else, and salvation is not restricted to those who have entered the ecclesiastical ark. Matthew 25 is in harmony with the Apocalypse of Shadrach, a Christian work of uncertain date which declares that people outside the church can have God's Spirit and upon death may enter the bosom of Abraham. The interesting point for us is that in Matthew 25, the doers of good deeds encounter Jesus without knowing it. Although one guesses that Proverbs 19:17, "Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full," is in the background, the precise thought remains opaque. Is the Son of Man, who elsewhere in Matthew seems to be the ubiquitous divine presence, somehow mystically united with those who suffer? Or is the connection more formal, so that the world's king, by a sort of royal proxy, identifies himself with his people? Or is some other idea in mind? I don't know. Whatever the answer, Christian tradition sometimes attests the notion that one can encounter the divine reality revealed in Jesus of Nazareth without knowing anything about him. The 2nd century Christian apologist, Justin Martyr, rewriting ideas he learned from the Stoics, urged that Jesus was the Logos, of whom every tribe of men and women partakes, and that those who, before he came, lived their lives with the Logos were Christians, even if they were reckoned to be atheists, such as, among the Greeks, Socrates, Heraclitus, and those like them. By the way, I've always understood Socrates, but Heraclitus has always been a bit of a stretch for me. I don't think he was that nice a guy. Anyway, Justin also affirmed that the Stoics owed their admirable moral teaching to the seed of the Logos planted in them, and that other pre-Christians spoke well in proportion to the share or part they had in the seminal divine Logos. For Justin, Jesus Christ was the personification of a divine life that had made itself known to lesser degree at other times and places. Justin believed not only that the pre-incarnate Word had spoken to some of the Greek philosophers, but also that he had appeared to Old Testament saints. According to the apologists, the appearances of the angel of the Lord in the books of Moses were revelations of the Logos. Here the notion that some have entertained angels unawares turns into the notion that some have entertained the Son of God unawares. And once more, the divine Word active in Jesus of Nazareth is thought of as having been present in the world long before the first century. The idea becomes a picture in Rubelev's famous icon of the Trinity, in which Abraham's three angelic visitors are the three persons of the Godhead, one being Jesus Christ. Whatever one makes of Justin's exegesis of Old Testament theophanies or of his philosophical conception of the Logos, Christian theology has always sought to enlarge the person of Jesus. The doctrines of his pre-existence and of his session at God's right hand are ways of saying that his birth to Mary and Joseph was not his beginning and that his death on a cross was not his end. The divine reality incarnate in Jesus can't be confined to one man's span of life. Rather, the activities of the Word contain but exceed the activities of a first-century human being. Those who think like this may well wonder, as did Justin Martyr, whether or how that divinity might be revealed to people unacquainted with the Christian traditions about Jesus. I won't pursue further this line of inquiry, which is inevitably speculative. I simply observe that, for those with certain religious convictions, the divinity manifested in Jesus of Nazareth can't be reduced to that historical figure, so the question of how people might come to know that divinity is all the more complicated. And with that, I'm done. It remains only to thank all of you so much for patiently listening to my stammerings. Thank you very much.
2008 completed. Please join me once more in thanking our distinguished guest and lecturer, Professor Dale Allison.